I've spent 17 years studying wildlife in places most people will never see, tracking wolves through taiga forests, documenting bears emerging from winter dens, cataloguing the secret lives of creatures that exist at the edge of human knowledge. I thought I understood what moved through these frozen places. I thought I had mapped the boundaries between the known and the unknown. But on a February evening, alone in my research station, with sleet hammering against the windows and the aurora painting the sky in ribbons of green fire, I watched footage that shattered every certainty I'd built my career upon. The motion sensor camera I'd mounted on the ridge above Serpent Valley had triggered at dawn 3 days prior, and what it captured in those 47 seconds of grainy, snow-swept video wasn't a bear standing upright, or a moose caught at an unusual angle, or any rational explanation my mind desperately tried to construct. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, moving with a purposeful gait that spoke of intelligence and intention. Its form was humanoid, but wrong in ways that made my hands shake as I replayed the footage again and again, watching how it paused to examine my equipment, how its head turned toward the camera with what seemed like recognition, how it simply walked back into the whiteness as if dissolving into the landscape itself. I must have watched that clip 200 times that first night, my coffee growing cold, my radio crackling with unanswered messages from my team at base camp. The creature moved through the frame with a fluidity that contradicted its size, its body covered in white-grey fur that rippled in the wind like water, and there was something in its posture that suggested awareness far beyond animal instinct. I'd seen every predator this region had to offer, studied their movements, understood their behavior patterns, but this was different in a way that reached past my scientific training and touched something primal and ancient in my chest. The way it stopped and seemed to look directly at the camera made my breath catch every single time, because in that moment of frozen connection, I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with technology or lenses or motion sensors. It knew. Whatever this thing was, it understood what the camera meant, understood that someone on the other end was watching, and in that understanding lay an intelligence that both fascinated and terrified me. My colleagues would dismiss it, I knew that immediately, would call it a hoax or misidentification or demand better footage before even considering the implications. So I said nothing. I copied the file to 3 separate drives, erased it from the shared server, and told no one what I'd found. That decision, that moment of secrecy born from a fear I couldn't yet name, was when everything began to change. Sleep became impossible after that, not from fear, but from an obsession that burned through my thoughts like fever. I would lie in my bunk, staring at the ceiling while the station creaked and settled around me, and in those spaces, between waking and dreaming, I would see vast expanses of ancient ice, glaciers that predated human civilization, and shapes moving through snowstorms that had raged for 10,000 years. The dreams felt less like products of my subconscious and more like memories being transmitted from somewhere else, visions of a time when these mountains belonged to forces that had no names in any modern language. During the day, I would catch myself staring at the ridgeline, searching for movement, and at night I began hearing sounds that didn't belong in my catalogue of wilderness acoustics. They were vocalizations, deep and resonant, that seemed to roll down from the peaks and echo through the valleys in patterns that felt almost linguistic, almost structured, as if something was speaking in a tongue that existed before words. My team noticed my distraction, asked if I was feeling all right, suggested I might need to rotate back to town for a mental health break, but I deflected their concern with lies about research breakthroughs and new tracking theories. The truth was I couldn't leave, couldn't turn away from what I'd seen, because somewhere beneath my scientific skepticism, beneath my years of academic training and rational thought, something ancient was waking up in my blood. I would catch myself remembering my grandmother's voice from childhood summers spent in her village, The stories she told by firelight, while the elders nodded and the children listened with wide eyes. She spoke of things that walked these mountains long before people came, of agreements made between the first humans and the old inhabitants, of boundaries that must be respected and rules that could not be broken without consequence. I had dismissed those stories as folklore, beautiful mythology from a culture I respected but didn't truly believe, the way educated people smile at creation myths while trusting only in data and evidence. But now, staring at that footage in the blue glow of my monitor screen, with the wind howling like voices outside my walls, I felt those childhood warnings resurfacing like objects emerging from melting ice. My grandmother had called them the old ones, and she had looked at me with an intensity I'd never forgotten when she said that some people are born with the sight to recognize them, whether they want that gift or not. I stopped attending team meetings, claiming equipment malfunctions required my constant attention in the field, and my colleagues' concern gradually shifted to annoyance and then to a careful distance that suited me perfectly. The isolation felt necessary, protective even, as if what I was pursuing required solitude to fully reveal itself, as if the presence I'd captured on camera would only show itself to someone who had separated from the safety of numbers and consensus reality. My research station became less a scientific outpost and more a monk's cell, Spartan and focused, every surface covered with topographic maps, marked with sighting locations, printouts of the footage analyzed frame by frame, and notebooks filled with observations that grew, increasingly abstract and difficult to categorize using standard wildlife documentation methods. I began hiking alone to the ridge, where the camera had captured the figure, spending hours in the cold studying the landscape, looking for patterns in how the trees grew and where the snow accumulated, and which routes through the terrain felt somehow significant in ways I couldn't articulate. The rational part of my mind recognized these as symptoms of obsession, possibly even the early stages of isolation psychosis. But that voice grew quieter each day, drowned out by a deeper knowing that whispered I was finally paying attention to something that had been calling me my entire life. At night, the vocalizations grew louder and more frequent, those deep, resonant sounds that seemed to carry meaning just beyond my comprehension, and I would stand outside my station in the bitter cold, straining to decode them, convinced that if I listened carefully enough, I would understand the language being spoken across the darkness. My sleep contracted to brief periods of unconsciousness, filled with dreams of ancient ice. And in those dreams, I walked through blizzards beside towering figures whose faces I could never quite see, and they showed me things, memories of when these mountains were young, and the agreements were first made between species that should not have been able to communicate, but somehow found a way. The turning point came during a particularly vivid dream, more visceral and detailed than anything I'd experienced before, where I stood on a glacier that stretched to every horizon and watched as my grandmother approached through falling snow, young and strong as she must have been decades before I was born. She spoke in her language, which I had never properly learned despite her attempts to teach me, but in the dream I understood every word as she explained that the old ones are not creatures in the way science defines living things, not animals to be studied and catalogued and reduced to data points on population charts. They are guardians, she said, manifestations of the land's consciousness, beings that exist in the spaces between matter and spirit, and they have walked these mountains since the ice first came, watching and remembering and maintaining balances that modern people have forgotten ever existed. Some bloodlines carry the old agreements in their bones, she continued, placing her hand over my heart with a touch I could feel, even in sleep, and those who carry this inheritance have responsibilities they cannot escape simply by earning degrees and calling themselves scientists instead of seers. I woke, gasping in the pre-dawn darkness, with her words still echoing in my mind, and for the first time since watching that footage, I felt something shift inside me, a recognition that this obsession wasn't madness but awakening, a remembering of something my education had tried to bury, but my blood had never forgotten. I made coffee with shaking hands and watched the sun rise over the peaks, and in the growing light I saw what I'd been missing, patterns in the landscape itself. The way certain valleys seemed to pulse with presence, the way the mountains arranged themselves like sentinels around spaces that felt charged with ancient intention. That day, I began reviewing not just my recent footage, but years of archived material from cameras scattered throughout the region, and once I knew what to look for, I found it everywhere. Subtle signs I'd previously dismissed as equipment glitches or natural phenomena. Shapes moving at the edges of frames during snowstorms, unusual formations that appeared and disappeared, moments where the wildlife seemed to respond to something outside the camera's view, acting with coordinated purpose that suggested they were reacting to a presence they recognized as dominant and significant. I cross-referenced these anomalies with my grandmother's stories, which I now remembered with startling clarity, and began to see correlations between the locations of these occurrences and the places she had described as sacred, as boundaries, as territories that belonged to the old ones and required permission to enter. The scientific framework I'd relied on for nearly 2 decades began to feel like a language inadequate to describe what I was discovering, too rigid and reductive to capture phenomena that existed outside materialist assumptions about reality's structure. I found myself speaking aloud to the empty station, trying to articulate theories that blended indigenous knowledge with quantum physics, consciousness studies with ecology, creating hypotheses that no peer-reviewed journal would ever publish, but that felt more true than anything I'd written in my academic career. The vocalizations at night seemed to respond to my presence with increasing intentionality, growing closer and more varied, and I began to understand them not as animal calls, but as something closer to song, rhythmic and purposeful, perhaps even as attempts at communication from an intelligence testing whether I was capable of understanding. By the 3rd week of my isolation, I had made a decision that I knew was either profound insight or complete delusion, and I no longer cared which, because the pull had become irresistible, undeniable, a gravitational force acting on every cell in my body. I would go into the deep wilderness alone, beyond the established research zones, into the heart of what my team called the Triangle, a region of particularly dense and disorienting terrain, where equipment frequently malfunctioned and even experienced guides reported feeling watched and unwelcome. I packed supplies for a week, loaded my gear with cameras and recording equipment, and left a vague note about checking remote sensors, knowing that if something went wrong, no one would find me for days, possibly weeks. If the weather turned, the morning I departed, I performed a small ritual my grandmother had taught me as a child, offering tobacco to the 4 directions and speaking words I barely remembered, but that came to my lips as if my ancestors were guiding my tongue, asking permission to enter sacred territory and promising to walk with respect and open eyes. As I shouldered my pack and headed toward the tree line, I felt the weight of generations pressing against my back. Every hunter and storyteller and medicine person in my lineage watching to see if I would honor what they'd preserved or betray it with the arrogance of modernity. The sky was heavy with unfallen snow, and the silence was so complete it felt like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do, who I would choose to be in the moments that were coming, whether I would finally become what my blood had always known I was meant to be. The memories came in fragments as I walked deeper into the wilderness, triggered by the smell of pine resin and the particular quality of light filtering through ancient spruce. Sensations that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something older living inside me. I was 7 years old again, sitting on my grandmother's kitchen floor while she prepared salmon, her knife moving with practiced precision as she told me stories that my parents dismissed as superstition, but that she delivered with the gravity of historical fact. She spoke of the old ones in a matter-of-fact tone, the same voice she used to discuss weather patterns or berry seasons, as if their existence was simply another aspect of the natural world that required acknowledgement and respect. They were here before us, she explained. Guardians appointed by forces she couldn't name in English, beings that maintained agreements made when her ancestors first came to these mountains and asked permission to hunt and fish and build their lives in this unforgiving beauty. Some families were chosen as liaisons, she said, her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me understand this wasn't just story, but inheritance, bloodlines that carried the responsibility of remembering when others forgot, of honoring the protocols that kept the balance between human need and the land's deeper requirements. I asked her what the old ones looked like, expecting monster tales, but she shook her head and said they wore whatever form the observer's mind could comprehend, appearing as great bears to some, as ancient humans to others, as shadows or lights, or simply as presence that made the hair stand on your neck and your heart remember prayers you'd never been taught. She made me practice phrases in her language that day, words of greeting and respect, a short verse that acknowledged the territory belonged to others, and I was only a visitor seeking safe passage, and though I repeated them dutifully, I didn't understand their true purpose until now, decades later, as they surfaced in my memory with crystalline clarity. The summer I turned 12 was the last extended visit I spent with her. The summer before high school and college applications and the gradual drift toward a life my grandmother watched with sad, knowing eyes, as if she could see me choosing a path that would lead away from what she'd tried to teach me. We went hiking together in the foothills, moving slowly at her pace, and she showed me things I'd looked at my whole life without really seeing, patterns in how animals moved through the forest, subtle markers on trees that indicated boundaries and territories, places where the air felt different, and she would stop and perform small rituals before proceeding. At one clearing, she pointed to a configuration of stones that appeared natural, but which she insisted had been arranged deliberately, markers left by the old ones to show where their realm began and human hunting grounds ended, warnings that most people could no longer read, but that still carried power for those with eyes to see. She told me about researchers and trappers and developers who'd ignored these boundaries over the years, men who laughed at the warnings and pushed deeper into protected territories with their equipment and their certainty that the land existed for their use. And she described how some came back changed, haunted, and incoherent, while others never came back at all. Their disappearances explained away as accidents or poor preparation, but understood by her community as the inevitable result of disrespect. I asked if the old ones killed people, and she looked at me with something like disappointment, as if the question revealed how thoroughly Western education had already colonized my thinking. They don't kill, she said. They teach, they remind, they show consequences to those who violate agreements their ancestors made, and sometimes those lessons are harsh because the balance they maintain is more important than individual human lives. She gripped my shoulder then, her fingers surprisingly strong, and made me promise that if I ever encountered them, I would remember who I was, whose blood ran in my veins, and that I would show the respect my lineage had maintained for generations. I promised easily, abstractly, the way children promise things they can't imagine ever mattering, having no idea that promise would one day become the only thing standing between me and a fate I was now walking directly toward. My grandmother died when I was in graduate school, and I came home for the funeral feeling like an outsider in my own family's grief, unable to participate fully in the traditional ceremonies because I'd let the language and the cultural knowledge slip away in pursuit of degrees and publications. Her sister pulled me aside after the service and gave me a small bundle wrapped in worn leather, explaining that my Grandmother had left instructions for me to receive it when I was ready, though the old woman had doubted I ever would be. Inside was a carved bone pendant on a sinew cord, stained with age and use, marked with symbols I didn't recognize, but that stirred something deep in my chest, an ache of recognition without understanding. There was also a note in my grandmother's handwriting, shaky but legible, with a single sentence in English, followed by several lines in her language that I couldn't read. When you finally see them, you'll understand everything I tried to tell you. I'd kept the pendant in a drawer for years, occasionally coming across it while searching for something else and feeling a pang of guilt and loss before closing the drawer and returning to my research, to the comfortable world of data and empiricism, where mystery was just a problem requiring better methodology. But I'd packed it for this journey, driven by instinct I didn't question, and now as I walked through wilderness that felt increasingly liminal and strange, I pulled it from my pocket and hung it around my neck, the bone resting against my sternum like a second heartbeat. The moment it touched my skin, I felt something shift in the quality of my perception, as if a frequency I'd been unconsciously filtering suddenly came through clear and strong, and I realized my grandmother had been trying to prepare me for this my entire childhood, planting seeds that would only germinate when I finally stopped running from what my blood had always known. The forest grew denser and more difficult as I pushed deeper into the triangle, the terrain taking on qualities that seemed to resist easy navigation, trails that appeared clear from a distance, but dissolved into impassable tangles when I reached them, landmarks that shifted position in ways that defied topographic logic. I should have been frightened, but instead felt an odd calm, as if I were being tested rather than threatened, guided through a maze that would only reveal its center to someone who approached with the right intention and respect. My grandmother's words circled through my mind like a prayer or mantra, her voice as clear as if she walked beside me, and I found myself speaking aloud in her language, those phrases she'd made me practice, words that tasted ancient on my tongue and seemed to resonate with the landscape itself. The pendant grew warm against my chest, and twice I saw movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly, presences that paced me through the trees just beyond clear sight, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer alone, that I'd crossed some invisible threshold and entered territory where different rules applied, and my scientific credentials meant nothing compared to the promises my ancestors had made. The tracks appeared 2 days into my solitary journey, pressed into soft ground near a glacial stream where the earth still held memory of what touched it. They were massive, easily twice the length of my own boot prints, showing 5 distinct toes with a stride that spoke of power and purpose, and I knelt beside them, feeling my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, as if some dormant part of my DNA was responding to evidence it had always expected to find. I photographed them out of habit, then immediately questioned why, remembering my grandmother's teachings about capturing images of sacred things, how photographs could trap essence in ways that violated ancient protocols. I deleted the images, whispering an apology in her language, and instead simply sat with the tracks, placing my hand inside one and feeling the depth of the impression, the reality of weight and substance that transformed this from theoretical pursuit into undeniable encounter. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me, that peculiar silence that isn't absence of sound, but rather the presence of focused attention, and I understood I was being observed, evaluated, judged for my worthiness to continue. The pendant pulsed warm against my chest as I stood and followed the tracks deeper into territory that felt increasingly liminal, where ordinary forest gave way to something older and less bound by conventional natural laws. Within hours, I began finding the structures my grandmother had described, but that I'd dismissed as metaphor or misunderstanding. arrangements of materials that defied casual explanation and spoke of intelligence and intention. The first was a formation of birch saplings bent and woven into an arch over a narrow deer path, the trees still living but shaped with such precision that no natural process could account for it, creating a threshold that marked passage from one type of space into another. I hesitated before walking through, remembering childhood, warnings about crossing certain boundaries, then spoke the words of greeting and respect before stepping beneath the arch, feeling a distinct change in air pressure and temperature as I passed underneath, as if moving through a membrane into territory governed by different principles. Further on, I discovered stones arranged in spirals and lines that aligned with distant mountain peaks, patterns that suggested astronomical knowledge or geographic mapping far beyond what indigenous communities were supposed to possess, according to academic orthodoxy, and I felt shame at my own internalized assumptions about primitive versus advanced cultures. These weren't random assemblages or animal activity misinterpreted by hopeful cryptozoologists, but deliberate constructions that served purposes I could only begin to guess at. Markers and messages left by intelligence that had inhabited this landscape since before my ancestors crossed the land bridge. I found tree breaks at heights no bear could reach, massive limbs twisted and folded, with force that spoke of immense strength applied with careful precision, creating signs visible from great distances to those who knew how to read them. Each structure I encountered intensified the feeling of being led rather than hunting, guided along a specific route toward a destination I hadn't consciously chosen, but that felt inevitable. Nonetheless, the most unsettling discovery came at dusk in a grove of ancient spruce, where the light filtered green and gold through needles that whispered in wind I couldn't feel on my skin. Someone had constructed a dome of interlaced branches reinforced with moss and bark, large enough to shelter a creature of considerable size, and around it were scattered objects that spoke of intelligence engaged with human artifacts in ways that scrambled my understanding of primate behavior. I found a rusted camping knife arranged beside smooth river stones in deliberate pattern, a torn section of canvas draped carefully over low branches, metal tent stakes driven into the ground in geometric precision around the structure's perimeter. These weren't stolen goods hoarded by an animal, but seemed more like offerings arranged with ceremonial care, or perhaps attempts at communication using human objects as vocabulary in a language of placement and relationship. I circled the structure slowly, barely breathing, aware that I might be standing in something equivalent to a home or sacred space, and that my presence constituted profound intrusion despite my good intentions. The ground around the dome was compressed and smooth from repeated use, and I could smell something musky and organic that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human, a scent that triggered deep biological responses my rational mind couldn't override. As full darkness approached, I backed away carefully, continuing to speak soft words in my grandmother's language, and I swear I heard something in the forest's depths respond with a sound that might have been vocalization or might have been wind through hollow wood, but that carried the cadence of speech. That night I made camp at respectful distance from the dome structure, building my fire small and keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening, as if I were the one being studied and needed to prove my peaceful intentions to an observer whose judgment would determine my fate. I ate cold food to avoid insulting smells of cooking, arranged my sleeping bag with the opening, facing the structure in what I hoped conveyed openness rather than challenge, and placed small offerings at the edge of my camp's firelight. Bits of dried salmon and tobacco that my grandmother had taught me were appropriate gifts when entering territory belonging to others. The pendant lay heavy and warm against my heart as I settled in to wait, every sense heightened beyond normal capacity, and I felt the boundaries of my individual identity becoming porous and uncertain, as if the person who'd started this journey was dissolving and something older and more essential was emerging to take his place, someone my grandmother would have recognized. even if I no longer recognized myself. The frozen lake revealed itself at dawn, a vast expanse of blue-white ice stretching between mountain walls that seemed to lean inward like witnesses gathering for testimony. And I stood at its edge, feeling the cold radiate up through my boots, while my breath created small clouds that dissipated into air. So unclear it hurt to perceive its purity. I had followed a trail of subtle signs through the pre-dawn darkness, guided by instinct more than visible evidence. And now the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the ice in shades of rose and gold that made the landscape feel less like wilderness and more like cathedral, sacred space where ordinary rules suspended themselves in deference to older laws. The lake's surface bore no tracks, no marks of passage, just perfect windswept ice that reflected the mountains with such clarity that sky and stone became indistinguishable, creating disorientation that made me grip my walking stick for anchor to vertical reality. Then I saw it across the expanse, perhaps 200 yards distant, standing absolutely motionless at the far shore where ice met forest, and every system in my body locked into hyper-alert stillness as predator-prey instincts warred with something deeper that whispered this was neither predator nor prey, but category entirely separate from conventional biological classification. It was massive in a way that photographs could never capture, easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders broad as a grizzly's, but posture upright and unmistakably humanoid, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making the figure appear less like creature and more like hole cut in the world's fabric, through which something from elsewhere was observing our dimension. We stood frozen in mutual regard across that pristine expanse, and I felt my grandmother's presence so strongly I nearly turned to look for her. Certain she was standing beside me witnessing this moment she'd prepared me for throughout childhood, even as I dismissed her teachings as colorful mythology rather than practical instruction for inevitable encounter. The creature didn't move, but I felt its attention focused on me with intensity that was almost physical pressure against my chest, and I understood with certainty beyond rational explanation that it was perceiving me in ways human senses couldn't match, reading my intentions and history and ancestral connections like text written in languages of heat and electromagnetic signature and quantum resonance my species had forgotten how to consciously access. My hand moved without conscious decision to the pendant at my throat, fingers closing around the carved bone that suddenly felt warm as living flesh, and a moment I touched it, the creature's head tilted slightly in what might have been recognition or acknowledgement, the first movement it had made since I'd spotted it. I wanted to call out, but found myself voiceless, throat closed, not with fear, but with the peculiar paralysis that comes from standing at thresholds where words become inadequate tools for the communication required, where language itself feels like child's toy brought to adult ceremony. Tears began streaming down my face without emotional precursor, my body responding to stimuli my conscious mind couldn't process, and I tasted salt and felt the moisture freeze on my cheeks while my vision blurred and cleared in waves that might have been shock or might have been awakening to perceptual modes I'd never accessed before this moment. The creature raised one massive arm in gesture that was unmistakably deliberate, not threatening, but indicating, pointing towards something along the northern shore, and then it moved with grace, impossible for something its size, turning and walking into the forest with steps that made no sound I could hear across the distance, vanishing into shadows between trees, as if the darkness itself had reached out and pulled it into spaces that existed parallel to normal geography. I stood, trembling at the lake's edge for uncounted minutes, needing to remember how to make my lungs work and my heartbeat in normal rhythm, feeling like someone who'd briefly died and been resuscitated with memories of other realms, still clinging to their consciousness like cobwebs. The intelligence I'd witnessed in that gaze was undeniable, and profound, not animal cunning but awareness that suggested complex thought and cultural knowledge, and perhaps even spiritual dimensions my materialist scientific training had no framework for acknowledging. This wasn't unknown primate or evolutionary offshoot existing in biological isolation, but something that inhabited different category entirely, something my grandmother's people had known and negotiated with for millennia before Western science arrived, insisting that only certain forms of knowing counted as legitimate. I felt the foundations of my worldview cracking like this lake's ice under spring pressure, the neat categories and empirical certainties I'd built my career upon revealing themselves as provincial assumptions rather than universal truths, and the person who'd begun this journey seemed like naive child compared to whoever was emerging from this encounter's transformative pressure. My grandmother had tried to tell me that some beings walked between worlds, that the boundary, the northern shore, demanded 3 hours of careful navigation around the lake's perimeter, following a route that seemed to reveal itself step by step, as if the landscape was testing my commitment to this pursuit, and with each forward movement, I felt the boundary between researcher and participant growing thinner until I could no longer pretend objective observation was possible in territory where I'd become part of the equation rather than external witness to it. The trees grew denser as I progressed, their branches interlocking overhead to create tunnel-like passages where snow had been blocked from reaching the ground, leaving corridors of exposed earth and ancient needles that muffled my footsteps and made the forest feel like vast organism whose respiratory system I was traveling through. My grandmother's pendant still felt warm against my chest, pulsing with heat that seemed to intensify when I veered off course, cooling when I corrected my direction, becoming navigation system that operated on principles my scientific training couldn't explain, but my ancestral memory recognized as older technology than compass or satellite. Then the forest opened into a clearing dominated by rock formation that hadn't been visible from the lake. Stone face rising 30 feet, with dark opening at its base, partially obscured by fallen timber, arranged in patterns that looked less like natural collapse and more like deliberate concealment, and my stomach dropped with premonition that whatever waited in that darkness would fundamentally alter my understanding of what I'd been pursuing and why. I approached the cave entrance with legs that felt disconnected from my body's control systems, driven forward by compulsion that overrode survival instinct, screaming at me to turn back while there was still time to choose ignorance over knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. The timber barricade was old but not ancient, constructed perhaps decades ago, and as I began carefully removing branches, I noticed modern materials mixed with natural elements. Nylon rope, weathered grey, and metal clips corroded but still recognizable as equipment from previous generations' outdoor technology. My headlamp beam penetrated the opening, revealing space larger than expected, natural chamber extending back into mountain's interior, and as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped so dramatically I could see my breath transformed into thick fog, that my light turned into swirling galaxy of illuminated vapor. The cave floor was level and dry, covered in fine dust that showed no recent tracks except the deep impressions leading inward, the creature's footprints unmistakable in their size and spacing, evidence that I was following precisely where it intended me to go. Then my light found the first shape against the western wall, and my mind needed several seconds to process what my eyes were reporting, rejecting the information before finally accepting that I was looking at human remains, skeleton still partially clothed in rotted fabric that might once have been expedition gear, positioned sitting upright as if the person had chosen that spot to wait for end they knew was coming. I counted 4 bodies total as my light swept the chamber, each positioned in different area, as if they'd been placed deliberately in arrangement that suggested respect rather than violence, and the equipment scattered around them told stories of different eras spanning back to at least the 1960s, based on design elements I recognized from historical research archives. Here was a camera body that might have been cutting edge in 1970, its metal housing corroded but lens still intact, like blind eyes staring at nothing. There, a backpack frame of military surplus style common in the 80s, fabric completely deteriorated, but metal skeleton maintaining its shape like memorial to its owner's vanished flesh. These weren't victims of attack, but casualties of transgression, people who'd pushed too far into territory that had its own guardians and protocols. And I understood with sickening clarity that the creature had brought me here not as threat, but as education, showing me the precedent for what happened when researchers forgot they were guests in realm that predated human presence and would continue long after human extinction. My hands shook as I photographed the scene with clinical detachment that felt obscene under circumstances, documenting evidence I already knew I would never share with authorities who would want to mount recovery operations that would only add more bodies to this collection. I found journals in waterproof cases, pages filled with increasingly frantic observations, as each researcher had apparently experienced their own version of what was happening to me, rational scientists confronting phenomena that unraveled their epistemological frameworks and left them stranded between worlds without adequate maps for navigation. The final body sat furthest back in the chamber beside stone formation carved with symbols I recognized from my grandmother's teachings, marks that represented agreements between her people and the old ones, treaties written in visual language that predated alphabet and carried meanings that couldn't be fully translated into modern tongues. This person had positioned themselves deliberately before these markings as if seeking protection, or perhaps requesting permission that wasn't granted, and clutched in skeletal fingers was a notebook open to final entry dated December 1998. Ink still legible after decades in this preserved environment. I read words written by someone named Thomas Hardwick, anthropologist from university back east, who'd come seeking definitive proof of what he called the wilderness guardian, and his final sentences described encounter almost identical to mine at the frozen lake, the mutual recognition and the creature's gesture leading him here to this cave where previous seekers had ended their journeys. But where Hardwick had interpreted this as threat and barricaded himself in this chamber, waiting for attack that never came, I understood the distinction my grandmother's teachings provided, recognizing that the creature wasn't imprisoning intruders, but showing them the cost of proceeding without proper protocols, offering choice between retreat with humility or advance into territory where human rules no longer applied and survival wasn't guaranteed. I stumbled backward from Hardwick's remains, my headlamp beams swinging wildly across the cave walls and creating monstrous shadows that seemed to move with independent volition. And in that disoriented moment, I finally grasped what my grandmother had been trying to teach me during all those childhood summers when she'd spoken of the old agreements between her people and the guardians who maintained the balance between human ambition and natural law. These researchers hadn't died from violence, but from isolation and exposure after refusing to turn back, choosing to wait in this cave for answers that would only come to those who approached with humility rather than entitlement. And I realized I stood at the exact same crossroads they had faced with my next decision, determining whether I'd join their silent company or return to the world with wisdom that couldn't be captured on camera or published in academic journals. A creature hadn't killed these people. Their own inability to understand the terms of engagement had killed them, their scientific frameworks providing no vocabulary for the kind of knowing required in territory where consciousness predated civilization and intelligence took forms that couldn't be measured by human metrics. My grandmother's voice, echoed through memory, speaking words I hadn't understood at 8 years old, but which now carried devastating clarity. The old ones don't speak our language because we forgot how to speak theirs, and they show rather than tell, because watching is the only teaching that survives translation, across the gap between their world and ours. The pendant against my chest had gone cold, no longer pulsing with warmth, but emanating chill that spread through my torso like liquid ice. And I understood this was indicator that I'd reached the boundary beyond which my ancestral protection couldn't follow, the point where I had to make choice based entirely on my own understanding rather than inherited safeguards. I thought of my career, the reputation I'd built on objective observation and empirical data, the colleagues who respected my dedication to scientific rigor and would be waiting for findings from this expedition that I could never provide in terms they'd find acceptable. But I also thought of my grandmother's disappointment. During my last visit home, when I'd dismissed her stories as cultural mythology, interesting for anthropological purposes, but not literally true, and how her eyes had filled with sadness, not for herself, but for me, for the part of my heritage I'd amputated in pursuit of credibility in institutions that had no framework for knowledge systems outside their own narrow parameters. These bodies represented the endpoint of that rejection, researchers who'd pursued their objectives right up until the moment when the land itself said no further, and they'd lacked the cultural tools to hear that boundary being enforced. I was different only because my grandmother had planted seeds of understanding that I'd ignored but not completely destroyed. And whether those seeds could grow quickly enough to save me from similar fate remained terrifyingly uncertain as I stood in chamber that served as museum of failed transgression. I dropped to my knees before the carved stone, my scientific equipment suddenly feeling like weights trying to pull me down into the same earth that had claimed my predecessors, and I began speaking words I'd thought I'd forgotten, phrases in my grandmother's language that she'd made me memorize during rituals I'd performed with childhood's unquestioning participation before adolescent skepticism had convinced me such practices were primitive superstition. The words felt awkward in my mouth, pronunciation uncertain after decades of disuse. But as I continued, I felt something shift in the cave's atmosphere, subtle change in air pressure or temperature that suggested I was being heard by presence that existed beyond range of my headlamp's illumination. I wasn't praying exactly, but acknowledging, performing recognition of forces that human activity hadn't created and couldn't control, admitting that my presence here was intrusion rather than right, and requesting permission to withdraw without adding my remains to the collection surrounding me. The ritual my grandmother had taught me was about establishing proper relationship between human, visitor and ancient territory, protocol for crossing boundaries without claiming ownership, and as I spoke I understood why the creature had led me here. Not to threaten, but to provide context for choice I had to make between proceeding as entitled researcher or retreating as humbled guest who'd glimpsed mysteries not meant for documentation. When I finished speaking, the silence in the cave felt different, less oppressive and more expectant, and I made my decision with clarity that came from source deeper than rational calculation, rising to my feet and backing toward the entrance, while keeping my light on the stone carvings rather than the skeletal warnings, showing respect for the boundary markers rather than fixating on consequences of violation. I would leave this place and return to civilization, but not as the same person who'd entered, carrying knowledge that would separate me from colleagues and career, but reconnect me to heritage I'd nearly lost in pursuit of acceptance from systems that couldn't comprehend what my grandmother's people had always known. The old ones existed not as biological specimens to be studied, but as guardians maintaining agreements that predated human arrogance, and I'd been granted glimpse of their world only because enough of my grandmother's teaching had survived my education to make me salvageable where others had been beyond. Reach. As I emerged from the cave into twilight that had fallen during my time underground, I understood the creature would be watching to ensure I honored the choice I'd made. And my journey back would be test of whether I'd truly learned distinction between knowing about and knowing with, between studying and participating, between data and wisdom. The creature came to my camp 3 hours after full dark, announcing its presence, not with sound, but with absence of sound, as every natural voice in the wilderness fell silent in response to something moving through the forest, with footfalls so careful they seemed designed to demonstrate restraint rather than stealth. I sat beside my fire, feeding it steadily smaller branches to keep the flames low and non-threatening, remembering my grandmother's instruction that light should invite rather than challenge, illuminate shared space rather than claim territory through aggressive brightness. My equipment lay packed and ready for departure, cameras deliberately stowed without activation, because I understood now that some encounters existed outside the framework of evidence and documentation, moments that lost their essential truth the instant you tried to capture them for audiences who weren't present. The pendant against my chest pulsed with warmth again, steady rhythm that felt like encouragement or perhaps acknowledgement that I'd made correct choice in the cave, and I focused on that sensation to steady my breathing as something massive began circling the clearing just beyond the firelight's reach. I could feel its presence the way you feel thunderstorms building before the first drops fall, atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic charge announcing forces too large to ignore, and I fought every instinct screaming at me to run because I understood this was the final examination, the moment when the creature would determine whether my ritual in the cave had been genuine understanding or merely strategic performance. The sounds began gradually, low vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple directions, simultaneously as if the creature was testing acoustics or perhaps demonstrating abilities that defied normal physical constraints. At first, the calls were clearly animal, deep resonant notes that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. But then they began shifting and modulating in ways that suggested intentional experimentation. Sounds, approaching the register and rhythm of human speech without quite achieving articulation. I heard syllables that almost formed words, patterns that nearly became sentences, as if something was reaching across evolutionary distance, trying to find frequency where communication might be possible between consciousnesses that had developed along completely separate trajectories. My grandmother had told me the old ones remembered when humans were different, when we still participated in forms of knowing that didn't require language, because they operated through direct transmission of understanding. And these vocalizations felt like mourning for that lost connection, attempt to bridge gap that human development had created by choosing abstraction over immediacy. I found myself responding without conscious decision, humming tones that matched the creature's pitch and rhythm, not trying to form words, but simply demonstrating willingness to meet it in space between our respective kinds of intelligence. And for several minutes we conducted exchange that my colleagues would never classify as communication, but which carried more meaning than most conversations I'd had in professional settings. Then it stepped into the light, not fully, but enough that I could see portions of its form illuminated by firelight that made its fur appear simultaneously ancient and timeless, white and silver and colors I had no names for because they seemed to shift based on angle of observation. The creature was massive, beyond anything my footage had suggested, easily 9 feet tall and proportioned in ways that suggested strength developed over millennia of surviving an environment that tested every physical limit. But what struck me most profoundly was its face, which carried expression of such complex awareness that my entire understanding of consciousness and intelligence crumbled into inadequacy. This was not an animal displaying clever mimicry or even great ape intelligence, but something that thought and felt and understood in ways parallel to human cognition while remaining fundamentally other. And in its eyes, I saw recognition that mirrored my own, two forms of awareness acknowledging each other across divide that science insisted shouldn't allow for mutual comprehension. The creature made no threatening moves, didn't approach closer or display aggression, but simply stood in that liminal space between darkness and firelight, while making sounds that I suddenly understood weren't attempts to speak my language, but invitations for me to remember languages older than words, communication systems my ancestors had known before civilization convinced them such knowing was impossible. We remained like that through the longest night of my life, the creature, maintaining its position at the threshold while I sat beside my fire, fighting against every framework my education had provided, trying to open myself to forms of understanding that my grandmother had preserved, but which I'd buried under layers of academic credential and professional identity. The creature would vocalize, and I would feel meaning. Wash through me not as translation, but as direct knowing, communications about territory and respect, and agreements that had been maintained for thousands of years before being forgotten by cultures that mistook technological advancement for evolutionary superiority. Sometimes it would gesture with hands that were too human in their expressiveness, pointing toward the mountains or the sky or the fire between us, and I would understand it was teaching me about relationships between elements, about my place in systems I'd been trained to study from outside rather than recognize myself as participant within. Around midnight, it did something that broke me completely, reaching into the darkness and producing a bundle of items that I slowly recognized as belonging to the researchers in the cave, not taking them as trophies, but returning them to human custody. And I wept, understanding this was act of extraordinary grace, the creature serving as guardian even for those who died, refusing its guardianship, maintaining dignity for remains that could have been simply left to the mountains that claimed them. As dawn approached with the sky shifting from absolute black to deepest blue, I felt something rising within me that I couldn't name using any vocabulary my education had provided, a remembering that came not from conscious memory but from deeper strata of knowing that existed in blood and bone and ancestral experience. The creature had fallen silent and stood completely still, waiting with patience that suggested it existed in temporal framework different from human urgency, and I understood that this moment required something from me that couldn't be approximated or improvised, but had to emerge. From authentic connection to knowledge my grandmother had spent decades trying to help me preserve. I reached for the pendant still warm against my chest and felt my fingers moving through gestures I didn't remember learning, positions and movements that felt simultaneously ancient and immediate, and realized my grandmother had taught me these motions disguised as children's games during long summers in her cabin, embedding ritual practice into play so that it would survive in muscle memory even after my conscious mind dismissed such traditions as cultural artifact rather than living practice. The words came next, not English or even the Yupik phrases I'd learned as child, but something older that my throat seemed to remember how to shape, syllables that felt like wind and ice and the patient breathing of mountains, and I spoke them toward the creature while continuing the hand movements that traced patterns in the air between us. The creature responded immediately, its massive body shifting into postures that mirrored my gestures with precision that confirmed this was indeed language we were speaking, communication system that operated through movement and sound and intention woven together into meaning that transcended any single channel. I felt knowledge flowing into me, not as instruction, but as remembering, understanding that what I was performing wasn't supplication or negotiation, but acknowledgement, recognition of agreements that my ancestors had made with the land's guardians, promises to move through wilderness with respect and take only what was needed, and remember that humans were participants in vast systems rather than masters of resource extraction and territorial conquest. The ritual required me to offer something back, and I found myself placing my research notes into the fire, watching years of observations and data collection curl into ash while feeling not loss, but liberation, understanding that some knowledge couldn't be preserved in academic journals because it existed in relationship rather than documentation, in ongoing practice rather than frozen record. The creature watched these offerings burn and made sounds that I felt as approval, not pride or satisfaction, but recognition that I'd chosen understanding over evidence, participation over observation, and that this choice returned me to older human tradition of living within mystery rather than believing our purpose was to eliminate it through relentless categorization and measurement. When I completed the final gestures, tracing symbols in the air that represented agreement renewed rather than permission requested, something shifted in the atmosphere between us, boundary dissolving not into unity, but into proper relationship. 2. Different forms of consciousness, acknowledging each other as legitimate participants in shared reality. The creature approached then, moving with deliberate slowness until it stood directly across the fire, close enough that I could smell earth and ice and something else that reminded me of my grandmother's cabin during ceremonies I'd been too young to understand, and it extended one massive hand palm forward in gesture that somehow transcended species and culture to communicate fundamental respect. I raised my own hand to mirror its position, and though we didn't touch across that final distance, I felt connection establish itself like circuit completing, current of understanding, flowing between us, that carried more information than any conversation I'd participated in during my entire professional career. Knowledge about guardianship and responsibility and the true cost of human forgetfulness regarding our place in systems we'd convinced ourselves we stood outside. The creature held that position until the sun broke the horizon, first light striking us simultaneously, and then it lowered its hand and stepped backward into shadows that seemed to gather around it like welcoming darkness. And I understood I was being released, not because I'd passed some test, but because I'd remembered something my culture had nearly succeeded in destroying, and that remembering made me safe to return to the world I'd come from. As the creature disappeared into the forest with silence that seemed impossible for something so massive, I felt the pendant against my chest grow cool again, its work completed, and I knew without being told that I would never see the guardian again, but would carry its presence within me for whatever years remained of my life. I sat beside my dying fire while the mountains emerged from darkness into morning light, and everything looked simultaneously identical and completely transformed. Same landscape now revealed as sacred text I'd been reading as merely geological formation. Same wilderness now understood as maintained relationship rather than pristine absence of human influence. The researchers in the cave had ventured forth with same credentials and training that I possessed, but they'd lacked the protection my grandmother had embedded in childhood teachings, and their remains served as testament to what happens when humans enter sacred spaces, carrying only institutional authority rather than ancestral knowledge of proper approach and acknowledgement. I packed my camp with movements that felt like prayer, and as I began the long walk back toward what I could no longer honestly call civilization, I knew I was carrying secret that would reshape everything about how I moved through the world, and that protecting that secret was itself the practice my grandmother had been preparing me for since I was young enough to believe that games and rituals might be the same thing. The return journey took 3 days, but it existed outside normal temporal measurement, each step feeling like passage through threshold between worlds, as I moved from the deep wilderness where Guardians still maintained ancient agreements back toward human settlements, where such concepts survived only as folklore studied by anthropologists rather than living practice honored by communities. I carried nothing but my basic survival gear, having left behind all recording equipment and research materials, understanding that what I'd experienced couldn't be translated into the institutional language of wildlife biology or captured by instruments designed to measure phenomena while remaining separate from them. The mountains watched my passage with what felt like patience, and I found myself speaking quiet words of acknowledgement to the land as I walked, practices my grandmother had demonstrated that I'd previously categorized as cultural tradition, rather than recognizing as actual communication with consciousness embedded in landscape itself. By the time I reached the access road, where I'd left my vehicle weeks earlier, I understood I was arriving not as the same person who had departed, but as someone who'd been unmade and restructured around different organizing principles, and that the career and identity I'd constructed over decades of academic training no longer fit the shape of who I'd become through a single night of remembering what my ancestors had always known. The administrative tasks of extracting myself from institutional life took months, but felt strangely simple, each meeting with department heads and funding agencies revealing how little they understood about what research actually meant, how thoroughly they'd convinced themselves that knowledge existed only in data collection and peer review, rather than in relationship and lived experience and wisdom passed through generations, in forms that couldn't be quantified. I told them I'd experienced equipment failure that corrupted all footage and field notes, watched them process disappointment that their investment had yielded no publishable results, and felt no guilt about this deception because I understood I was protecting something infinitely more valuable than career, advancement, or institutional reputation. My colleagues expressed concern about my decision to abandon years of work, suggested I was experiencing isolation-induced psychological distress, recommended therapists and medical leave, and all the interventions that modern frameworks provide for people who no longer fit comfortably within consensus. Reality. I accepted their concern with gratitude, while knowing I couldn't explain that I wasn't suffering breakdown, but breakthrough. Not losing my mind, but recovering faculties that Western education had systematically trained me to dismiss as primitive superstition, rather than recognize as sophisticated engagement with aspects of reality that materialist science had declared non-existent, rather than admit its instruments couldn't measure them. I settled in a small cabin outside my grandmother's village, close enough to participate in community life, but far enough to maintain the solitude necessary for integrating what I'd learned and what I now carried as responsibility. My grandmother had passed 5 years earlier, but I felt her presence constantly, finally understanding the lessons she'd been teaching through stories and songs and seemingly casual conversations that I now recognized as careful curriculum designed to preserve knowledge in someone who'd been destined to travel far from traditional ways before hopefully finding path back again. The elders in the village accepted my return without surprise, as if they'd been expecting someone to eventually emerge from the wilderness, carrying the weight I now bore, and they invited me into ceremonies I'd been too secular to appreciate during childhood visits, rituals I could now recognize as maintenance of agreements that kept proper relationship functioning between human communities and the consciousness that inhabited landscape. I participated in these practices with humility of someone who'd nearly lost connection entirely, and through seasons of repetition, I began to understand that what I'd experienced wasn't unique vision granted to special individual, but recovery of perception that had once been common to all humans before we'd convinced ourselves that extracting resources and collecting data represented advancement rather than catastrophic forgetting of how to live as participants rather than conquerors. The footage I'd destroyed would have made my career confirming existence of species that Science insisted couldn't survive in modern world, but I understood that such confirmation would have unleashed exactly the kind of attention that would violate the agreements I'd renewed during that dawn ritual, bringing researchers and media and inevitably development to areas that remained protected only through their official designation as empty wilderness rather than recognized as inhabited by guardians humanity had mostly forgotten. I kept no physical evidence, but carried permanent record written in changes to how I perceived and moved through reality. And I knew my grandmother would have recognized this as the real documentation, the kind that lived in person rather than filing, cabinet, and could be transmitted only through direct relationship rather than institutional channels. Sometimes at dusk I stood at the edge of my small property looking toward the mountains, and I felt the guardian's presence like distant but steady signal, reminder of what waited in the deep places for humans who approached with respect rather than entitlement. And I understood my purpose now wasn't to reveal this secret, but to protect it, to live as bridge between worlds that modern culture insisted were separate, carrying knowledge that humanity wasn't ready to receive but might desperately need, if we survived long enough to remember that we'd forgotten something essential about who we are and how we belong to systems vastly larger than our temporary civilizations. What would you sacrifice to protect a truth the world isn't ready to hear? Subscribe to journey deeper into the mysteries that wait at the edges of everything we think we know.